When setting up the machine for threading pipe, you'll always need to make 1 or 2 test cuts to verify that your thread length and diameter are set correctly. Firstly, I'll install the pipe. In this instance, we're going to be cutting 1-inch NPT threads. Make sure that the carriage is in the furthest back position and the stock stop has swung down in front of the die head. Grab the material. You're going to move the material into the self-centering vise until making contact with the stock stop. Then you'll spin the hammer wheel on the side of the vise and hammer to make sure you have a solid grip. Once you've got your material installed, you can raise or lower the stock steady rest, which will help when loading and unloading material for production runs. Alright, I've made contact with the pipe, and I'll screw down the lock nut. With the material in the vise, we're ready to turn on our spindle. First, we'll need to check the threading speed chart on the side of the machine. Look up pipe, size 1 inch, 87 RPM. Coming back to the front of the machine, use the green start button to turn the spindle on. And we'll adjust the RPM with this knob. Bring it up to 87. One or 2 RPM on either side won't make much of a difference. Another thing to note is if you are threading a harder material such as stainless or a harder machining material, this speed will be variable depending on the material. For stainless steel, you would want to lower it. With our spindle speed selected, we can turn on our coolant and we can perform a test cut. Simply advance the material into the die head using the hand wheel, and once engaged, you can release the hand wheel and the carriage will feed automatically. Stop the spindle, turn off the coolant. We can measure our thread length. I'll loosen the material in the vise, pull it back a little bit, grab some calipers, measure the thread length. Overall thread length on this piece of pipe is 1.216. For 1-inch NPT, you want that to be roughly 0.984. So that means we'll have to adjust the length stops on the side of the carriage. The stops that control the thread length are on the right side of the carriage and ride on this trip rod and are activated by this trip arm on the side of the carriage. As the carriage moves forward, the trip arm approaches the trip stop, advancing the trip rod forward until the die head is triggered open. Since our thread was far too long, we'll need to move the stop back some. Using an Allen wrench, loosen the stop and move it back about the gap between your desired thread length and the thread length you last measured. And then simply tighten that trip stop. And that's how you adjust your thread length. I'm going to cut a few more pieces and get that thread length dialed in. Alright, got my thread length adjusted. I'm going to load another piece of material. Just do one more test. Show you that thread length. Advance the material into the die head. Once it's engaged, you can let go. carriage will advance forward on its own till tripping the die head. We'll bring our carriage back. We'll measure our thread lengths. Got my caliper set to the proper length. You can see that we're right on. Now we can set the diameter. The preferred method for testing the diameter on a piece of NPT pipe is to use an NPT ring gauge. Simply thread the gauge onto the threaded material until it no longer moves easily. We'll read the gauge by counting the threads sticking out past the end of the gauge. To be within NPT standards, you need plus or minus one thread from the end of the gauge. As you can see, we've got about 2 or 3 threads sticking out the end, so we'll need to adjust our die head to bring the diameter out a little bit. To adjust the Oster rotating die head for over and undersized diameter threading, you will need to first open the die head as if changing dies. Once the die head is open, you can swing the headstock cover door up and out of the way so as to get a better view of the die head. What you'll need to do is jog the die head until you can see the scale for oversized and undersized adjustment come into view. You'll see the scale on the top of the die head. It's marked with a 0, which is going to be the standard setting, and then you're marked with a scale from 10 to 30 thou, undersize and oversize on each size. To perform the adjustment, you'll first need to loosen the 2 nuts on your die head using the torque wrench that came with your machine. Once those nuts are loose, locate the eccentric pin on the inside of your die head, and this is how we'll perform the actual adjustment. Using a flathead screwdriver engaged with the eccentric pin, you can rotate the pin to the right and left to adjust the scale on the die head. Once you are satisfied with the adjustment you've made, you'll need to lock the nuts on the die head again. To tighten the nuts on the front of the die head after making your over or undersize adjustment, you'll again need the torque wrench that came with your machine. When tightening the die head for bolt threading, you will want between 18 and 22 foot-pounds of torque. When tightening the die head for pipe threading, you will want between 22 and 25 foot-pounds of torque. Simply tighten the nuts on the head until the torque wrench engages. Now that the diameter adjustment has been made, we can cut another test piece and check our diameter. Thread the ring gauge on. The end of the pipe is very nearly flush with the edge of the gauge, which means we're within tolerance of plus or minus 1 thread. So we've got the proper diameter for 1-inch pipe.